Alright friends, we are back again today with a brand new Masters of the Universe Classics Origins video. And today we will actually be going through and sharing some rankings with you for each of the figures. Of course, this is an incredible line and it's full of a lot more hits than misses. So really, some of these, especially the lower ranked figures, will come down to more of my personal preference. Keep in mind, this is just my personal opinions and are not objective in any way, so of course your mileage may vary substantially. As a matter of fact, I encourage you to make your own video in the same format, and I would love to put a link to your video in my video description. And of course, if you don't want to make a video, you can just comment with your picks down below. I would love to hear why you agree or disagree with many of my picks. So there are 22 standard retail line figures that have been released so far in early 2021. So we will not be covering the Lords of Power box set. Since it's not a general retail item and is at a very premium price point, I don't really feel that it really applies to this particular list. Without further ado, let's get started. We're going to be doing our list today from the bottom to the top. So let's go ahead and let's start with some of the figures that maybe are some of the least appealing, just to me personally. So number 22 at the bottom of the list is the Prince Adam that you get with the Sky Sled vehicle. I think that it's a fine figure and it does exactly what it's supposed to do in terms of representing Prince Adam, but it has to be one of the least exciting releases in the line, which makes it pretty smart on the part of Mattel that they actually made it a vehicle pack-in figure. I think it looks good for what it is, but in the end, it has a couple of things going against it. For one thing, the pink color is a little garish and perhaps a little off from the original source. Also, it uses the original He-Man head, which, although is a pretty good head on its own, is certainly fairly weak compared to what they would do later on in the line. So with those two things going against it, it's a kind of unremarkable figure, and maybe they could have sold more Sky Sleds had they packed in maybe an Eternian Guard figure, so that people might have felt more compelled to army build that particular vehicle. And next up, at number 21, we have Zodak. Even though Zodak is quite a bit more interesting than Prince Adam, at the same time I feel like there's a couple of areas where this figure is a little strange for me. And this is just a true example of just how subjective this list is. Zodak just never really quite worked for me in his original form, so I was always really happy to see Zodak with a K in the 2000X Masters series definitely address some of that blandness that I felt about the original figure. You can see that he kind of has no neck and sort of a pin head, and due to those two things, the proportions around the neck area are really thrown off. That, mixed with the strange monster feet, which are just an element of the original design, and the kind of slightly too lightly toned red that doesn't exactly match from the vest to the helmet, and he's a rather bland figure. He just ends up having the weird look of a guy who's half dressed, and that with kind of an unexciting ray gun accessory and sort of an expressionless head means that he ends up near the bottom of the list for me. The next figure we'll be looking at in the number 20 slot is Stratos. Now, this is actually a really good, decent figure, but there are a couple of issues that kind of bring it down lower on the list for me. One of those issues is the head sculpt. Now, the original figure does have a very, very similar head sculpt, and this is just trying to be in service of that, so I completely understand it. But at the same time, it's a little exaggerated for my tastes, and maybe a little wonky in terms of the proportions, especially with how exaggerated the expression is. So that hurts it a little. The other thing is the fur sculpting on the chest almost seems a little soft. That combined with just trying to replicate some of the charm of the original figure, which is things like having the fur down here but nothing here, fur up here and nothing on the shoulders, just, of course makes it a little inconsistent, but it is trying to be true to that original. The jetpack is fine, it's a little plain for my taste, and everything else looks pretty good. It's just that it's not as much of a standout as some of the other figures and probably has more to do with maybe my lack of enthusiasm over the original. And at number 19 is Merman. I actually think this is a pretty good figure, but there's something about the color scheme with the overabundance of yellow, and it makes it less interesting than it probably should be. I think if they had tinkered with the colors just a little bit, I think that this would have been a much more appealing figure. As it stands, there's just not enough going on to keep everything from looking just two-toned, especially right around the face when you have yellow eyes, yellow teeth, and more of a yellow color of face mask then it kind of hurts its ability to look more visually interesting. Other than that, there's all kinds of great sculpting, and even though it's a little soft, I like the vest and think it works pretty well. The best part of the figure, in my opinion, is the sword with all these cool crustacean-looking underwater scales. So overall, not bad, but he does end up lower for me. Next up on my list is the original version of He-Man. I think it's really a very strong figure in every single aspect and does a great job of honoring that original He-Man figure. But especially looking now at what they ended up doing with the head sculpt to me is just a far cry from what I expected of the original He-Man. It ends up being not quite as refined as it would be later, but if we pop the head off and we add the new battle armor head, then I think He-Man actually becomes a top 10 level figure because this is such a great homage to the original, and I think it really transforms the entire look of the figure. However, I have to go with how the original release is, and in that case, He-Man is at number 18. For much the same reasons, clocking in at number 17 is Evil Lyn. Evil Lyn is an interesting figure, and I think for the most part they do a very good job, particularly with the sculpting on the body and the headdress and everything like that. But the head maybe is a little exaggerated, and certainly with the half-open mouth, it's certainly a little odd, like she's growling or something. I think that overall it's not a bad figure, but with the accessory being as bland as it is, I think that since she's just a reuse of Tila without as much going on, she ends up coming off as a little bit more boring. Number 16, Manny Faces. Now, I really like Manny Faces, and I think that he looks really great and very true to the original character and original toy, but I think that the kind of odd problem that it runs into is it sort of looks like it might be from a different line of throwback Masters figures. Why? Because it has much more of an animated look than the other figures have. So really, it's a great figure, and the sculpting looks very impressive, but I think it's due to maybe some of the softness in the head here. Now, the action feature is wonderful and works very well for what it is, but because his main head is one of them, it ends up being as soft as, say, the details on some of the accessories and things of that nature. Add that to a slight inconsistency in the color between the arms and the chest, which is a little more apparent on camera than it is in real life, and you have a figure that maybe isn't quite as consistent as some of the others in the line. Number 15 has to go to the original release of Skeletor. Even though that I think the figure is pretty representative of classical Skeletor, there is the question of why they chose with the introductory figure to go with kind of a more bizarre head sculpt, especially with the kind of shocked look on his face. It becomes definitely a big question as to why they would go in that direction. Everything else really works pretty well. You can see the colors and the details and sculpting are very good, but it's a little let down by their choice of head sculpt. While not, to me, quite as jarring as the odd look of He-Man's, it is a little disappointing. However, just like with He-Man, you can pop this off, and with very little effort, you now have a figure that is more at home and probably the upper part of the top 10. This is much more what you would expect from a classical Skeletor, and certainly something that I wish that they had thought of when the line first started. So it's something maybe they could correct in future releases of basic He-Man and Skeletor, and possibly just pack these heads in instead. For number 14, we'll be going with Orco. Now, that's not to say that Orco is not an impressive figure, because he is. I love the display stand in particular, with the cool transparency and the glitter hit on the inside. But with the actual figure itself, it's really sort of limited. He does come with a cool flying stand, but that's about all there is to him. I'm not really sure what else they could have done to have made it a little bit better. But there's also a little bit of paint inconsistency where one eye is a little off compared to the other. It's not major or anything, as of course you can expect with a cheaper mass market toy line. Combine that with not too much that you can do with the actual figure itself, and Orco ends up just being more of a fun display piece. However, I think he's very well sculpted and certainly one of the more accurate figures to the cartoon in the line, so not bad at all. Number 13 will have to go to Shira, the Princess of Power. I really like the figure. However, she does suffer from what we talked about with Manny Faces. She is, of course, looking more like she comes from a different line of figures. Something that the Masters Universe Classics line did very well was whenever they did a Shira, it felt like she actually belonged in that line. With this one, it's not quite that way. Because there's so many soft goods being utilized and they aren't anywhere else in the line, she definitely feels like that she's more of a Princess of Power figure rather than something that would go in Masters of the Universe Origins. I actually really like this because I do think that Shira deserves kind of her own identity and her own homage to those Princess of Power action dolls. However, at the same time, it kind of ends up taking her a little bit further away from the other figures than I would have anticipated. Nowadays, I think most people would probably think that Shira should probably be more representative of her Filmation look than of her original toy look. And with the ability to even do the mask look, then you definitely end up with something that's a little more in that direction than more of the Shira people would know. I still applaud them for being willing to do something that was really out there, and especially with the very impressive sculpted hair on the back, there's lots to love about this figure. It's just a little less consistent than maybe I would have liked. For number 12, I'll be going with Beastman. Beastman is a really cool figure, and I think that he turned out really well. I think that Beastman does a good job of homaging the original while still updating many of the elements of the sculpt. Perhaps Beastman's head sculpt needed a little bit more updating, and maybe going this accurate to the original kind of creates a little bit of a jarring presence compared to what most people expect from a Beastman figure. But I'm actually glad they went in this direction, even though the head looks a little soft compared to the rest of the details on the body. Other than that, he does come with this whip accessory, but I'm not really sure it works out too well. Of course, it's oversized, just like the original was, since it was meant to be a big gem accessory, if I'm not mistaken. It looks fine, however, it still looks a little large. Of course, that's a complaint that could be leveled against the original, and I think Beastman turned out really great. For number 11, I'll be going with Battle Armor Skeletor. I think that overall, everything works out very well, especially things like his action feature, which works far better than I think the original toys did. I also really like the sculpting. I think the chest armor looks really good, and everything else is practically reused. And of course we have a reused Havoc staff, but we get this cool shield. Other than that, I think he turns out really well. However, the head is a little jarring. With this much of an extreme expression, I don't think it works out as well as they hoped it would. I think it is very funny to see Mattel continually try to do these highly expressive Skeletor heads, and I'm glad that they're giving us something different. But I think there's a couple of things quite wrong here. One of them is that there's not enough sculpting to indicate teeth, and instead they're letting the paint do most of the heavy lifting, which could be a problem. The other thing is the eyes appear to be a little small. Skeletor's eyes should probably be a little more cavernous than that. Really, in the end, I think it looks okay, and I think the figure has a really nice presence with an excellent play feature. Alright, you're now looking at the top 10 figures, but what order will we go in? For number 10, we're going with Ram Man. Ram Man gets the number 10 spot for a few reasons. For one thing, he actually comes with a very useful alternate head. I really love what they did with the alternate head, and think it looks awesome to see him fully armored up. He also comes with two really neat accessories, and there's more articulation here than I thought there would be, since the arms are completely articulated, just like a regular release would be. And there's even some knee articulation, where you can swivel and you can see the hinges back there. There isn't any articulation though in the midsection, and there isn't any kind of waist articulation, but that's in service of the action feature. We go down, it clicks, and then one more and it pops back up. I think that this is a really great figure, and I think it really does, in terms of sculpting and in terms of look, honor the original Ram Man while still updating it for a modern audience, and even finding a way to incorporate the action feature. So I felt that Ram Man, even with his limited articulation, still deserved a spot in the top 10. And I would love to see them do more of this kind of thing with some of the more gimmicky characters from a little bit later in the line. I'm giving number 9 to another character that relies pretty heavily on an action feature. Here we have Roboto. As you twist, you can see that the mouth opens and the gears inside turn. I actually think that this is a really cool action feature, and I really enjoy it. I especially like looking at all the gears rotate. And on the back, you can see a similar action happen. I also really like the sculpting. I think they've done a great job of honoring the original sculpt while updating things like the arms, which look very much like the Masters of the Universe Classics arms. You also get all sorts of great fun with the changeable limbs. With those added accessories, it makes this a far more interesting figure than many of his counterparts. Even though some of his articulation is limited by his action feature, like no neck rotation, Everything else is pretty much intact, and I think it makes him a very fun update of a classic toy. For number 8, we'll be looking at Hordak. I really like Hordak, and I really like what they were able to do with him. I think it's a very strong, and I would almost call it just a remake of the original Hordak figure. I think that everything is really quite true to their original intentions with the figure. All the sculpting that you expect is there, like the Horde logos on the chest, the boots, and the armband. And I also really enjoy the Horde bat accessory that you get, and how that's applied to the figure. There's a couple of things that they probably could have done better. I would have liked to have seen maybe some different things going on with the bow. As I would say, the head sculpting is maybe a little soft here, but other than that, I think it's a really cool figure. And I definitely love Hordak, so they've done a great job of honoring that character. My number 7 pick would be Teela. I think Teela is a very strong figure in this line. Teela is one of those rare figures that does an incredible job of honoring the original while improving it in basically every aspect. The original Teela is a great classic figure, and this one does so much to remind you of it. As a matter of fact, from a distance, you may even think it is it. However, they have updated so many things. I love the snake headdress and all the intricate detail they pumped into it, along with the staff and the shield. However, you can take off the headdress. You get a fairly accurate Teela to the cartoon. The head sculpt actually is really nice, and I think very accurate to the original toy, while also feeling very much at home with her look in the original Filmation cartoon. The only thing that's a problem is there is some paint rub on the chest from the harness. However, for me, I plan on keeping the harness on most of the time, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal. However, it's something to point out, and it really couldn't stop the original intention of the design coming through and being so strong for this line. At number 6, we have Duncan, the Man-at-Arms. Now, I really love this because I think that they have done such a great job of, much like with Teela, updating the original look of the figure. If you remember, the original Man-at-Arms does not have any kind of mustache and is woefully inaccurate to the cartoon and many of the comics. This one addresses that very well by updating the sculpting of the armor and also adding a mustache to the head sculpt. Also, we have lots of the cool circuitry on the helmet painted, and everything else looks great. All of the armor is removable as well, so you could strip him down to basically just a green He-Man if you wished. I think that the head sculpt is so cool, and I think that the revisionist take on Duncan here works so much better than many of their other Wave 1 takes. So I actually think this is a rare case of improvement for one of the original figures. At the number 5 slot, we'll actually be looking at Ninjor, who is another very strong release in this line. Ninjor's greatest strength is just how accurate he feels to that original figure, but without any kind of soft goods or anything like that, he still manages to exude the charm of that figure. He also, in some ways, feels like a smaller D-make of the original Classics figures that we got several years ago. I really enjoy the crazy tampographic detail on the front of the dragon and sword. I also like that he comes with a bevy of original accessories, and that you can put those in different spots and store them on the figure. Because of that, and all of his original charm that is retained from the original figure, I really think Ninjor is one of their strongest releases yet, and is probably a good indication of what Mattel has planned for the remainder of the line. It's getting better and better. Number 4, leaving only villains behind, is Battle Armor He-Man. I actually really like this one. Some people aren't too fond of this head sculpt, but I actually think that it works really well. As a matter of fact, some people, I think, have mistakenly said that He-Man looks a little scared, and yes, maybe a little, but really, to me, it looks more like he's going into a berserker rage like Conan would. So because of that, once you have the axe lifted, I mean, tell me that Skeletor wouldn't be absolutely horrified. But I'm just saying that I think there's a strong argument to make for this head sculpt. However, here's the magic of this figure. If you don't like it, all you have to do is pop on the original head sculpt. The figure only gets better, and that's the great thing, is this is a figure where Mattel finally took the initiative and offered you many multiple options about what to do with it. This figure was also very important to me as a kid because it's the only original He-Man that I owned in the early 90s. So I really do get a big kick out of this, and it's just icing on the cake that the action feature works perfectly and can be easily reset without fear of it snapping back unintentionally like the original would. Also, with the energy effect, even though it's a little segmented there, it works very well and ends up looking really cool. Add the weapon storage on the back, and you've got a real winner. And I think it's probably the best version of He-Man that you can get right now in the line. And yes, I see me sneaking that Berserker head onto the standard body quite a bit. It's actually really good, guys. We're down to our top 3, and you can see it's all bad guys. Of course, that's the great tradition of Masters figures. Usually your villains are the stronger ones. So, I would say that it is Trapjaw. I actually think Trapjaw is an incredible figure. There's several things about him that work really, really, really well. One of them is the head sculpt. I think it looks absolutely devious with the kind of dead and soulless eyes. Not only that, but you have all of these really cool parts here. I think the arm looks very cybernetic and very twisted. And then combine that with the extra arm attachments that you can take on and off. And you can even use Roboto's attachments, which easily shift right on. And you have a figure that is just really cool. Even has the cool skull and crossbones logo on his like wrestling championship belt. He even has all of the neat robotic details on the legs. The belt even has storage for a lot of his arm attachments, and Trapjaw is an easy one to suggest. And of course, an opening and closing jaw, because if he's Trapjaw, yes, he has to have it. I just think that visually this one turns out so well, and it's one that I'm really happy to have in my collection. I actually think Triclops has the rare claim to fame that no other figure in the Origins line really has. He's a better representation of the character than the original release, the 2000X release, or the Classics release. Simply put, I think he's the best version of Triclops that we've ever gotten. For that reason, I feel that he deserves some attention. So what are my reasons for this? Well, the original Triclops figure is definitely its own thing. Definitely has its own kind of feel. When he was translated into being a Filmation design, that also kind of has its own look and feel, but this does a great job of kind of straddling that middle ground. And because of that, I think he ends up being more appropriate than either of the other releases in the Classics line. And if you look at the Classics line, the first one leans way too heavily into the original look of the figure, whereas the second one, the green, is completely off. This ends up being the very finest Triclops that I think Mattel has ever produced. For this one, there's not really any fancy reason. It's pure and simple, excellent figure design, great sculpting, and really striking color choices. And number 1 is Scareglow. You can see that we have dimmed the lights, and he is quite a striking figure indeed. Scareglow is the one that is the most sought after in the entire line, and there is definitely a reason that supports this. Scareglow is such a great figure and a wonderful representation of that original character. So what makes him so appealing? Well, Scareglow is sort of like a gnarlier version of Skeletor. He's more like a horror character, and of course there was a lot of confusion back in the day since the figure was called Evil Ghost of Skeletor. Then a lot of people ended up thinking that Skeletor had died and this was his ghost. This is so cool, and I think that it's just very purely a wonderful interpretation of that original Scareglow action figure. Because of that, he gets major points, and I think that's why he's so sought after. But there's more going on here than just being a standard reissue or slight tweak of the original figure. Instead, there is some very impressive sculpting, particularly with his cloak. You can see that if we go close, that there's all sorts of little sculpted bits of kind of like woven fabric in here. The effect from a distance is that it becomes incredibly difficult to tell that this is just sculpted plastic, and it actually ends up looking like the soft goods cloak that we all know and love. Even the drawstring that connects it looks like it's woven, but actually this is just a plastic kind of stretchy piece. And it's very impressive that they were able to engineer this and do it, and it's something that I really hadn't seen before in a figure. He does come with this accessory, which is kind of like a large Reaper scythe with the cool action feature and the slavish devotion to the source material while still updating it with the cool sculpting on the cloak, and this one is an absolute winner that everyone should have as a part of their collection. Well friends, I surely hope that you've enjoyed this countdown of all of the Masters Origins figures that have been released up until this point in early 2021. It's been a lot of fun to make, and of course I had to split a lot of hairs to come to a lot of these decisions. But remember, I don't expect your list of likes and dislikes to be exactly the same as mine. As a matter of fact, I would love to hear your take down below so that we can discuss. Part of the fun of being in any fandom is getting to hear other people's opinions and viewpoints. So if you agree or disagree, I would love to hear all about it down below. And remember, my offer still happily stands for anyone who wants to make a similar video. Comment with a link, and I will be sure to add it to the description of this video. So guys, thank you so much for watching today, and I cannot wait to come back to you with more Masters of the Universe content. Until next time, God bless you and yours. Take care. It's actually really good, guys.